The lie was written in a hand that tried too hard to look old. I noticed it the way you notice a false note in a hymn you have sung 1,000 times, not with the ears but with the spine. For 19 years I had stood watch in the muniment room of the Royal House of Harrowgate, the long cold gallery beneath the east wing, where the kingdom of Eldermore keeps its memory in ink and vellum and lead sealed boxes, marriage instruments, coronation writs, patents of nobility, deeds to lands whose owners were dust before my grandfather was born. Most men who wear the red tunic want the forecourt, the crowd, the cameras of the tourists who come to photograph a soldier who will not blink. I wanted the quiet. I wanted the vault. I am Corwin Vane, and my post was the past, and I had come to believe the past could not be argued with. I was wrong about that. The past can be argued with. Someone had been arguing with it for a very long time, in a careful, patient, criminal hand, and I was the only man alive who had read closely enough to catch him at it. It began on an ordinary gray morning, the kind Eldermore grows like a crop, with the archivist Master Pell asking me to fetch the coronation register for the Queen Consort's 10th anniversary. There was to be a service in the cathedral. Lady Verena wanted the exact form of words used at her mother's crowning, so the choir could echo them. A small errand. The sort of thing I had done 10,000 times, and I went down the iron stair with a lamp and a pair of white cotton gloves, and no more sense of doom than a man going to fetch his coat. The register was where it should have been. Box 41, third shelf, the year of the king's second marriage. I lifted it, and the weight was wrong. I want to be precise about this, because everything that came after turned on it, and because a man who accuses a queen had better be precise or he is a dead man walking. The box was too light by the weight of perhaps 3 sheets of vellum. I had carried that box before. I had carried every box in that room, dusted them, retied their ribbons, noted their condition in the ledger we keep of the ledgers. My hands knew the weight of box 41 the way a fisherman's hands know the pull of a full net against an empty one. And box 41 had been emptied and refilled, and whoever did it had matched the count of sheets but not the weight of them, because they had used newer vellum, thinner, and they had not carried the box 1,000 times, and so they did not know. I set it on the reading table, and I did not open it at once. I stood there in the lamplight, and I let my breath go slow, the way you do on the long ceremonial watches when your legs have gone to fire, and the only thing that gets you through the last hour is the discipline of not moving. Discipline is mostly the art of not doing the thing your body is screaming to do. And every nerve in me wanted to fling the lid off and prove myself a fool, prove it was only dust and a bad night's sleep. Instead, I opened it slowly, and I laid the sheets out one at a time in the order I found them, and I looked. The coronation writ was there. The consort's coronation 10 years back when King Alaric, a good man, an aging man, a man who had buried his first wife Queen Isolde and then, too soon for the whispers to settle, married the woman the court now called Queen Morwenna, had set the second crown on the second head. That sheet was genuine. I would have staked my life on it, and in a sense I did. The ink had the right bloom, the seal the right shrinkage, the fold lines the honest grime of a decade in a box. Beneath it lay the marriage instrument. The record of the king's second wedding, the legal spine of everything Morwenna was, and everything her children Lord Cassius and Lady Verena stood to inherit. And that sheet was a lie. I knew it before I could have told you why. Then I made myself tell me why, because feeling is not evidence and a queen is not toppled by a feeling. The hand was wrong. Not the king's clerk's hand. I knew that clerk's letters as I know my own name. He had a way of closing his lowercase g with a little back kick, a signature within the signature, the unconscious flourish no forger studies because no forger knows it is there. This G did not kick back. It closed neat and dead. The date was right. The names were right. The witnesses were right. Everything a forger could look up was correct, and the one thing he could not know, the private tick of a dead man's pen, was wrong. And there was a second thing, worse than the first. The genuine marriage instrument, the one I had handled years before when I first learned this room, had borne a clause. A small ugly clause that the court had swallowed at the time and then done its best to forget. A declaration of impediment, entered and then struck. When a king marries in Eldermore, the law requires that any prior bond be declared and dissolved before the new one stands. Morwenna, before she was Morwenna the Queen, had been a wife already, married young to a merchant of the northern coast, a man named in the old whispers only as the Factor, a marriage the court insisted had ended clean by his death before ever she came to Alaric. The impediment clause was where that ending was supposed to be recorded. Prior bond declared. Prior bond dissolved by death on such a date, attested by such witnesses. Without that recorded dissolution, the second marriage was no marriage. And without the marriage, there was no lawful crowning, and no queen and no line, and the whole gilded weight of a decade came down like a wall. The clause was gone. Not struck through, gone. The forged sheet had no impediment clause at all, because whoever wrote it could not fill in the dissolution, because the dissolution had never happened, because the Factor of the northern coast had not been dead when Morwenna knelt to marry a king. I sat down. I remember that I actually sat down on the archivist's stool, which I had never once done in 19 years, because a yeoman of the guard does not sit in the muniment room, and I sat down like an old man, and I put my gloved hands flat on the cold table to stop them shaking. Do you understand what I was holding? I was holding the fact that the Queen of Eldermore had never been the queen at all. That the crown she wore, the crown she would wear again this very month at the anniversary service, had never once sat legitimately on her head. That her son Cassius, whom she was grooming with such patient venom to stand a half-step nearer the throne than the king's own true-born son Rowan, had no standing whatsoever. And that someone, she, or someone in her pay, someone with a key to a room only 3 living men could enter, had come down here into the dark and unmade the truth and rewritten it, and had done it well enough that in 10 years no one had caught it, because no one else had ever carried box 41 1,000 times. I did not go to anyone. That was my first decision, and I have never regretted it, though it nearly killed me. Because think, who could I go to? The king was old and grieving and had loved his first wife and married his second in a fog of loneliness, and he was not a man to be handed a knife and told to cut out his own last decade of comfort. The court belonged, half of it, to Morwenna, bought and flattered and afraid. Master Pell, my archivist, was a good man but a soft one, and a soft man who learns a thing like this will confide it to exactly one wrong person before the week is out, and both of us will be found to have fallen down the iron stair. And if I brought the forged sheet to any of them, the sheet would vanish. It was the only proof. It was a single leaf of vellum, and against it stood a crown, and crowns have long arms. So I did the thing I had been trained to do without ever knowing I was being trained for it. I stood my post. I put the sheets back in the exact order and fold I had found them. I retied the ribbon. I carried the coronation writ up to Master Pell as if nothing had turned to ash in my hands, and I said, "The form of words is here, sir. I've copied it fair for the choir." And I gave him the copy I had made of the true and genuine writ, and I kept my face the face of a man who has fetched a book. And then I began, very quietly, to find out whether the Factor of the northern coast was dead. Because a forged sheet on its own is not enough to unseat a queen. A clever advocate of hers would say the true sheet had merely been damaged and recopied by some honest, careless clerk, that the missing clause was an oversight, that I was a resentful old soldier who fancied himself a scholar. I needed the other end of it. I needed the living fact the forgery existed to hide. If the Factor had truly died before the wedding, then the missing clause was only sloppiness, and I was a madman. But if he had been alive on the wedding day, if he had lived on, somewhere breathing, a lawful husband to a woman who had climbed into a king's bed and a queen's crown while still bound to him, then the forgery was not sloppiness. It was the murder of a fact, done to conceal a crime, and I would have not one leaf of vellum but a living man standing in the daylight. I began with the box's own record. Every time a document is drawn from the muniment room, we sign for it: name, date, purpose, the box, the leaf. It is the oldest rule of the place and the dullest, and I had enforced it on 100 impatient clerks. I went to the withdrawal ledger for the years around the king's second marriage, and I read every line, and near the end of the second year of the marriage, I found an entry in a clerk's hand for box 41, marriage instrument, for verification, by order of the Chamberlain's office, signed off and returned the same day. Returned the same day. You do not verify a marriage instrument in a single day. You verify it by writing to the parishes and the port authorities and the witnesses, which takes months. What you can do in a single day is take a leaf out and put a different leaf in. The clerk who signed was one Bram Otley. I knew the name. He had been a junior of the Chamberlain's office, and he had died 4 years back, they said, in his sleep. A young man, which is the sort of death that in a palace is either a great mercy or a great convenience. I felt the cold of the room go a degree colder. I had a forged sheet, and a withdrawal that matched the forgery in date, and a signatory conveniently dead. It was a rope with 2 ends and a body on it, and it was still not enough, because every man on it but me was dead or a queen, and the dead do not testify. I needed the factor. His name was not in our records. The impediment clause that would have held it had been cut out, but a marriage leaves a wake, and a first marriage more than most. I began to write letters. Not on palace paper. I bought plain stock from a stationer in the town on my day of leave and wrote in my own name as a private man researching a family line, the sort of harmless request that clerks in remote registries answer without a second thought. I wrote to the coastal parishes of the north, one by one, asking after the marriage of a woman of Morwenna's maiden name, Morwenna Aldous. She had been some 12-15 years back to a merchant factor. I did not name the king. I did not name the queen. I asked as a genealogist asks, dry and dull, and I posted the letters from 3 different towns so that no one clerk in no one registry would think it odd that a soldier of the capital was suddenly curious about a northern wedding. And then the hardest part of all, I waited, and I stood my post, and I watched the queen. Watching Morwenna was an education in patience, because she had more of it than any soldier I ever served with. Men speak of her as a schemer as though scheming were loud. It is not. It is the opposite of loud. In the 10 years I had watched her cross the forecourt and the great gallery and the long dining hall, I had never once seen her raise her voice, and I had seen her ruin 4 men, and none of them heard the blow coming. She ruined them the way water ruins a wall, 1 drop at a time, at the joint where no one looks. A word to the king that a certain steward had been careless with the accounts, dropped not as an accusation but as a worry, a wife's tender worry, so that the king himself came to believe he had discovered it. A softness of manner to a lord's wife that left the lord isolated and grateful and hers. She was, I will say it plainly, the cleverest person in that palace, and the only one cleverer than her had been the late Queen Isolde, who was dead, and whose things Morwenna had spent a decade quietly claiming. Isolde's rooms, Isolde's jewels, Isolde's grey mare that the children still asked after, Isolde's very place at the king's right hand, as if by wearing a dead woman's crown long enough she could stop being the second wife and become the only one. Now that I knew what I knew, I saw her differently. I saw the tiny discipline of her, the way she never let her eyes rest too long on the door to the east wing where the muniment stair went down. The way, once a season, she found a reason to send her own man, a lean, quiet fellow named Doon who wore the Chamberlain's livery, but answered only to her, down into the records, to check the inventories for the audit. I had signed Doon through that door myself more than once and thought nothing of it, and now I thought a great deal of it. She was not a woman who left a buried thing unwatched. She came back to the grave, quietly, once a season, and pressed the earth down. The first letter came back in 11 days. It was from the parish of Codmere, a fishing town so far north the sea freezes in the coves, and it was a dry official disappointment. No record of the marriage I described in their books for the years I gave. I had expected that. A woman who would forge a king's marriage instrument would surely have chosen to be married the first time somewhere the records were thin or lost. But I had written to 11 parishes, and I needed only one. The second and third came back the same, nothing. The fourth was returned unopened, the parish dissolved, its books transferred nowhere anyone could name. The fifth was a courteous note from a clerk who had clearly enjoyed the puzzle and found nothing. I stood my watches and I fetched my boxes, and at night in my narrow room I laid the returns out on the bed like a hand of cards that would not make a run, and I felt the thing slipping. 6 weeks gone. The anniversary service 2 weeks off, and a cold certainty growing in me that Morwenna had been more careful than any letter could reach, that the factor was a ghost by design, unfindable, that I would go to my own grave the only man who knew the Queen was no queen, and the only man unable to prove it. That was the night Master Pell told me, over the last of the lamp oil, that the withdrawal ledgers for the year of the king's marriage were to be sent for conservation. I kept my hand still. Which ledgers, sir? The Chamberlain's office asked for the lot of that decade. Dampen the bindings, they say. They'll be rebacked and returned. He said it with the mild pleasure of a man who likes to see old things cared for. He did not know that the withdrawal ledger for that decade held the entry in dead Bram Otley's hand, Box 41, the same day return, the second end of my rope. He did not know that conservation was the word under which a thing is taken away and comes back with a page missing, and no one able to say when it went. I understood then that the season had turned. For 10 years she had watched a grave that no one dug at, but something had changed. Perhaps her man Doon, on his last quiet visit, had felt the weight of Box 41 and found it right. I had put it back exactly, but Doon was careful. Or perhaps some instinct older than evidence had told her that the earth over the grave was disturbed. Whatever it was, Morwenna was moving to close the record for good, and she was moving now, and I had perhaps a fortnight before the one ledger that corroborated my one leaf of vellum was in the hands of the people it would hang. I did the only thing left. That night after the last watch, when the muniment room was mine and the palace slept, I took the withdrawal ledger down and I copied Bram Otley's entry in full, every word, the box, the leaf, the false pretext of verification, the same-day return, the very shape of his signature onto a sheet of the plain town stock, and I signed my copy and dated it and wrote beneath it, in my own hand, a plain statement of what I had found and why it mattered, and I sealed it. 1 copy. Then I made a second and a third. I hid them where I have never told any living soul but will not lie about now. One behind the false back of a box that has held nothing but a dead earl's hunting account since before I was born. One sewn into the lining of my own dress tunic, the red wool I would wear at the anniversary service. And one I carried on my next day of leave, out of the palace entirely, to the one man I had decided I could trust, though trusting him might cost me everything. His name was Sergeant Halloran, and he had taught me the drill when I was 19 and green, and he had left the guard 10 years back with a bad knee and a hard eye and no love at all for the second queen, having watched her from the ranks the whole first year of her reign. He kept a tobacconist's shop 3 streets from the cathedral now, and he let me talk for an hour without once interrupting, which is a rarer discipline than standing still. And when I had done, he was quiet a long while, and then he said the thing I have carried ever since. You've got the tail of the snake, lad, a leaf that's wrong and a clerk that's dead and a queen that watches a hole in the ground. It'll hang together for you and me by the fire. It won't hang together in front of the king, because every man on your rope is dead or wearing a crown, and the crown will say you're a jealous old cellar rat who forged the forgery yourself. He tapped the copied entry. You need the man. You need the factor breathing, or a stone with his death carved on it dated after the wedding, one of the two. A body or a grave, anything less she buries you with it. He was right, and I knew he was right, and I had 6 letters back with nothing in them and 1 fortnight left. I went back to the palace with a stone in my chest. The 7th letter was waiting in the town, post the following week. It was from the harbour master's registry of a place called Salt Fen, which is not a parish at all. That was my mistake. I had written only to churches, and a merchant factor's life is written not in churches but in customs books and cargo manifests, and the ledgers of the men who tax the sea. Some clerk in Salt Fen had received my genealogist's letter, found no marriage in his books because a harbour master keeps no marriages, but had the decency and the boredom to write back and say so, and to add, because he was a thorough soul, that the only Aldous in his registry at all was not a marriage but a levy. One Morwenna Aldous and her husband, a licensed factor of the port, assessed for the coastal duty in the very year of the king's wedding, assessed as a married pair. Alive both, and paying the king's own tax on the same date, the king was marrying the wife of one of them. I read it 4 times. Then I went very carefully to a place where no one could see my face, and I stood there until it was a soldier's face again. A levy is not a marriage certificate. Halloran had wanted a body or a grave, and a tax assessment is neither. But it was a king's own record. The harbour master of Salt Fen was a crown officer, his registry a crown book, sworn and sealed, and it placed a living husband beside a living Morwenna Aldous on the day she was, in the capital, becoming a king's wife. It was the second end of the rope, and it was better than I had dared hope, because it was not a leaf that could be quietly swapped in a room 3 men could enter. It was a public tax record in a distant port, one of hundreds of copies made every year for the treasury, scattered across the kingdom in a dozen offices. She could not swap them all. She did not even know they existed to swap, because a woman who thinks in churches and courts does not think of the flat gray machinery that counts barrels of salt fish. But a levy told me only that the factor had lived on the wedding day. It did not tell me whether he lived still. And a living man is worth 10 records, because a living man can stand in a hall and say, before the king, "That woman is my lawful wife, and I never died, and I never freed her." So I wrote once more to the harbour master of Salt Fen direct, still as a private genealogist, asking after the factor. I had his name now, Edric Sarn, asking whether the registry held any later mention of him, any death, any removal, anything at all. And while I waited on that last letter, I made the worst mistake of the whole business, the one that nearly ended it and me together, and I will not soften it in the telling. I let myself be seen to be curious. It was a small thing. On the eve of the anniversary preparations, the cathedral choir came to the palace to rehearse the coronation form of words, the true words, the ones I had copied fair, and Lady Verena came with them, Morwenna's daughter, sharp and lovely, and her mother's blade. She thanked Master Pell for the copy, and then she turned her clever eyes on me because I was the yeoman who had fetched it, and she said lightly, the way you comment on the weather, "They tell me you're the memory of this whole palace, Vane. That you've read every leaf in that cellar." And I, who should have grunted like a post and looked at the far wall as I had for 19 years, made the error of my life. I met her eyes. For 1/2 second, no more, I let her see that I was a man thinking, a man who knew things, a man to whom the past was not dead but living and dangerous. And her smile did not change at all, which is how I knew she had seen it. 3 days later my room was searched. It was done well, nothing taken, nothing obviously moved. But I am a man who lays his boots at a certain angle and folds his spare gloves a certain way, discipline in the small things being the root of discipline in the large, and the boots were wrong and the gloves were wrong, and the loose board where a careless man would have hidden a secret had been lifted and set back. I had hidden nothing there. The copies were behind a dead earl's hunting accounts, sewn in my tunic, and 3 streets away with an old surgeon. But they knew now to look. They knew there was something to find. And Morwenna, who watched a grave once a season, now knew that the cellar rat had teeth. The next morning I was reassigned. Master Pell told me himself, wretched with apology, not meeting my eye. "It comes from the Chamberlain's office." You're to stand the forecourt gate through the anniversary. A great honor, they call it, the senior man on the public post for the ceremony. He fussed with his papers. I'm to bring in a temporary man for the muniment while you're out front. Dune, they've named, just for the fortnight. Just for the fortnight. Dune, her man, alone in the muniment room with box 41 and the withdrawal ledgers, and no one to sign him in or out. For the fortnight it would take to strip every corroborating leaf from that room and send the lot to conservation. And me put out on the forecourt gate in full public view, where 1,000 tourists and 100 cameras would witness that I was doing my duty like a good statue and could not possibly be creeping about the cellars, and where, if I made any trouble, I could be quietly removed in front of witnesses as a soldier who had cracked under the honor of a great occasion. She had not silenced me. She had done something far cleverer. She had promoted me into a cage. I understood the shape of it entirely now, and the understanding was the coldest moment of my life, colder than the search, colder than Verena's smile. Morwenna had not merely forged a marriage 10 years ago. She was, this fortnight, sealing it forever, clearing the record, stationing her own man in the vault, and stationing me where I could do nothing but stand and salute while it happened. In 2 weeks the anniversary service would set the false crown on her head before the whole kingdom. The choir would sing the true words over the false queen, and every leaf that could have unmade her would be ash or conserved beyond reach. She was not covering an old crime. She was completing it. And the only thing she did not have, the one thing all her patience could not reach, was a living man in a far northern port whom she believed long dead, because she was the one who had put it about that he was dead, and had believed her own story so long she had forgotten it was a story. The last letter from Salt Fen reached me the night before I was to take up the forecourt gate. The harbour master wrote that he had searched the registry with some care, my earlier letter having caught his interest. Edrec Sarn, factor, licensed of the port, assessed for the coastal duty across 4 separate years, the last being the year following the king's marriage, and then no more. Not a death. The harbour master was careful to say he had no record of a death, no removal to the burial rolls, nothing. Only that Edrec Sarn had ceased 1 year after the king wed to pay the levy, and vanished from the books of Salt Fen as men sometimes do when they leave a port for good. The harbour master believed, though he could not swear it, that Sarn had gone west, inland, on account of some settlement or annuity, folk said, having come into a quiet living. Come into a quiet living. A man of the sea, a working factor, does not come into a quiet living inland the year after his wife marries a king, unless someone has paid him to become dead in every way, but the actual dying paid him to go far, change his name, hold his tongue, and let the world believe the sea had taken him. He was alive, somewhere west and inland, under a name that was not his own, an old man now, bought and buried in comfort, was the lawful husband of the Queen of Eldermore. And I had one clue to where west, inland, and 13 days, and I was to spend all 13 of them nailed to a gate in front of the entire capital. I did not sleep. I sat on my searched bed with the harbour master's letter, and I did the coldest arithmetic of my life. I could not go west. The forecourt gate would hold me every daylight hour, and to abandon the post was to be arrested and everything I carried searched and found. I could send another. Halloran had a nephew, a steady lad, a carter who went where the roads went. But a factor bought into silence 10 years ago does not open his door to a stranger asking about a queen. I needed to reach a frightened old man, hidden and paid and afraid, and persuade him to unbury himself and travel to a capital where the woman he had been paid to fear ruled from a throne, and to do it in under 2 weeks, and to do it all while I stood at a gate and saluted her carriage every morning. It could not be done by a soldier, so I did not send a soldier. I sent the only kind of messenger a frightened old man might believe. I wrote a letter that would go, by Halloran's carter nephew relay riding west along the inland road asking after a newcomer of 10 years back come into a quiet living, to a man named Edrec Sarn, or whatever he now called himself, and I wrote it not as an accusation, and not as a summons, but as the one thing that might move a coward to courage. I wrote it as a promise of protection and a plain telling of the truth. I told him I knew what he had been paid to be. I told him no harm was sought against him, that the law of Eldermore punishes the forger and the bribe giver, not the poor man frightened into taking the coin. I told him a king was being deceived and a true Prince Rowan was being quietly robbed of his birthright, and a dead first queen's memory dishonored, and that one leaf of vellum stood between the truth and its burial, and that I, a soldier who had guarded that leaf for 19 years, would guard him with my life if he would only come and say, before the king and the law, the single true sentence. I am Edric Sarn, and I was never dead, and that woman was my wife when she married your king. Then I sealed it, and gave it to Halloran to give to his nephew, and the next morning at first light I put on the red tunic with the third copy sewn in its lining, and I marched out to the forecourt gate, and I took up my post before the eyes of the whole kingdom, and I began to wait for a ghost to walk west out of the mist and choose, after 10 paid years of silence, to be a man again. The forecourt gate of Harrowgate is the most watched post in the kingdom and the loneliest. 1,000 strangers a day stood before me with their phones raised, filming the soldier who would not move, and not one of them knew that the soldier was drowning. I stood the regulation 2 hours and was relieved and stood again, and between the watches I could do nothing, could not go west, could not enter the muniment, could not so much as write a letter without being seen. The cage was perfect. All I could do was watch the palace go about the murder of the truth in plain view and salute it. And I did watch. That is the one thing they had not reckoned on, that a man at a gate sees everything that passes through it. I saw Doon carry things out. Not documents, not openly. He was too careful for that. But I saw the flat pine boxes go out on the 3rd morning, the kind the conservators pack ledgers in, 4 of them, loaded into an unmarked van at the tradesmen's arch where no tourist filmed. I counted them. 4 boxes of damp bindings, and I knew to a certainty that one of them held the withdrawal ledger with Bram Otley's hand in it, gone now to be rebacked without a certain page. I stood at my gate and saluted a lady's carriage and watched the second end of my rope drive away, and my face did not move, because that is the whole of what I am. A face that does not move while the world burns. On the 4th day Lady Verena crossed the forecourt to her mother's carriage and paused, as she had paused by the choir, to look at me. Not a word this time. Just the look, the long, amused, measuring look of a hunter who has treed the fox and is in no hurry. She wanted me to know that she knew, and that they were not afraid, and that the honor of the forecourt gate was a leash and she held it. I gave her the far wall. But I will tell you what I have never told anyone. That look frightened me more than any raised fist in 19 years of the ranks, because a raised fist wants to hurt you, and a look like that has already decided you are dead, and is only enjoying the interval. The days went by like that, each one shorter than the last, though the sun didn't know it. 6 days, 7, no word from the west. Halloran got a message to me by the oldest trick in the world. His nephew came as a tourist and stood before my post filming like the rest, and moved his lips as though awed, and said very low, "He's riding the inland road, asking at every posting in. Nothing yet. Long road, Corwin. Long, long road." And then he lowered his phone and moved on, and I stood there having heard the only news there was, which was no news, with 6 days left. On the 8th day came the false dawn, and it was the cruelest thing of all, because it wore the face of mercy. The chamberlain himself came to my gate, Lord Osric, a decent hollow man who did as the Queen wished because it was easier than not, and he stood beside me a moment looking out at the crowd, and he said kindly, as one soldier to another though he had never soldiered a day, "Vane, the Queen has been told of your long service. 19 years in the records, a life given quietly to the Crown's memory. She wishes to honor it. There's a pension being drawn up, a fine one, a cottage on the western estates, a garden, an annuity for your remaining years. You'd be free of the cold cellar and the cold gate both. She asks only that you retire after the anniversary with the crown's gratitude." He smiled at me. "It's a good end to a good career, man. Most of us don't get offered a garden." There it was, the reasonable middle. Not a threat I could have stood against forever. A gift. A soft cottage in the West, an annuity, an honorable end, and all I had to do was be an old grateful soldier who took the coin and held his tongue, exactly as Edric Sarn had done 10 years before. She was offering me his very bargain. She had done it once and it had worked for a decade, and she saw no reason it should not work again. And God forgive me, for the length of 3 slow breaths at that gate, I wanted it. I was 51 years old with a bad hip and a searched room and a ghost who would not come, and here was a garden, and no one would ever know I had bought it with my silence because I was the only one who knew there was anything to buy. I said, "That's a great kindness, my lord. I'll think on it with the gratitude it deserves." Which is what a soldier says when he means never in this life, and Lord Osric took it for a yes because hollow men hear what they want, and he clapped my shoulder and went away pleased, and reported to the Queen, I have no doubt, that the cellar rat had taken the cheese. And that was the one good thing to come of the false dawn, for a few days after they watched me less. Verena stopped crossing the forecourt to smile at me. They thought me bought. A bought man is not watched. A bought man is already dead and buried in his garden, and you turn your attention to the living. Which is exactly what I needed, because on the 10th day the ghost walked out of the west. I did not see him arrive. Halloran's nephew brought the word the same way as before, standing before my gate with his phone up, lips barely moving. "He's come. He's at my uncle's above the shop. Old and shaking and half wanting to run back west, but he's come. Uncle says hurry, he won't hold. Man's terrified, Corwin. Says the moment she knows he's breathing she'll have him stopped. Says he only came because your letter said you'd stand for him." A pause, the phone lowering and rising as though he'd got a better angle. 2 days to the service. What do we do? 2 days. And there is the trap I had not seen until it closed. I had my living man at last, 3 streets away above a tobacconist's, and I could not use him. Think it through as I did, standing at that gate with my heart going like a drum and my face a stone. I could not simply produce Edric Sarn at the palace door and demand an audience. The guard would turn him away, or worse, and word would reach Morwenna within the hour, and a frightened old man and a soldier's word would vanish into the machinery. The man packed off west again, or worse, myself arrested for bringing a lunatic to slander the Queen. I could not go to the king in private. Every private door to Alaric was watched by her people, and a yeoman off his post seeking the king alone would never reach him. I could not go to a magistrate. The courts of the capital sat under the Queen's long shadow, and the one leaf and one levy and one shaking old man would be swallowed, and I with them, in a quiet room, with no witnesses. Halloran had told me the truth by his fire weeks before, and it had only grown truer. My proof would hang together in front of the king, but it would never survive the getting there in private, because in private the Queen's arms were long and the witnesses were none. In private she won. She had always won in private. Private was her whole kingdom. So it would have to be in public. It would have to be somewhere she could not make me and my ghost vanish. Somewhere with 1,000 witnesses and 100 cameras and the king himself present and the law itself present. Somewhere so bright and so watched that the truth, once said aloud, could never afterward be unsaid or buried or explained away as a cellar rat's madness. There was exactly one such place, and exactly one such moment in the whole kingdom in the next 2 days. The anniversary service, the cathedral, the false crown, the true words, the king, the court, the choir, the cameras, and the whole of Eldermore watching a queen be honored. I would denounce her there, in the open. At the height of her own triumph, before the eyes of the kingdom, I would say the thing aloud that could not be said in any quiet room, and I would have the leaf in my tunic and the levy in my hand and the living man at my back, and I would say it where no long arm could reach past 1,000 witnesses to stop my mouth. It was madness, It was the maddest thing a disciplined man ever planned, and every year of my training screamed against it, because the whole of what I am is the man who does not speak, who does not move, who does not break the solemn thing, and here I was planning to shatter the most solemn occasion the kingdom had in the house of God before the king, with my own voice. If I was wrong about any part of it, if the leaf could be explained, if the levy could be waved away, if the old man broke and ran or was stopped on the road, I would not merely fail. I would be the soldier who defamed his queen at the altar, and there is no cottage in the West for that, only a cell and a shamed name and a fall down some iron stair. But I had run every other door in my mind 100 times, and every other door was hers. This one, the loud one, the public one, the one my whole nature forbade, this one she could not close, precisely because no one would ever expect the man who does not speak to be the man who speaks. I sent my answer back by the nephew the next time he passed. 4 words, lips barely moving, my eyes on the far wall the whole time, 1,000 tourists filming a soldier who seemed to be doing nothing at all. The cathedral, I'll signal, keep him warm and keep him hidden till the hour, and for the love of God don't let him run. Then I stood my last day at the forecourt gate, and I saluted the Queen's carriage as it rolled out to the eve of service blessing, and she did not so much as glance at the bought old soldier at his post, and I looked at the far wall and thought, "Tomorrow, madam, I am going to take your crown off your head in front of the world, and you do not even know my name." The night before the service I did not sleep, and I did not try. I sat in my searched room and I prepared, because a public accusation, unlike a private one, gets exactly 1 chance and no second breath, and it must be built like a wall, every stone in order, each one bearing the next, so that no advocate can pull one loose and bring the whole thing down as a madman's rubble. I set out my stones. The first was the leaf itself, the forged marriage instrument, but I would not carry the original into that cathedral, because the original was the one irreplaceable thing, and I would not risk it being snatched and torn in the confusion. I had done, over these weeks, the one thing that made the original safe. I had taken it quietly on my last free day in the muniment before they caged me, to a notary in the town, an honest sour man with no love for palaces, and had him examine it and take a certified photographic copy under his seal and stamp, attested, dated, describing the missing impediment clause and the false hand, and I had lodged the original itself with that same notary in his strong room against a signed receipt. The Queen's arms were long, but they did not reach into an independent notary's strong room without a warrant, and to get a warrant she would have to name the thing she wanted destroyed, in writing, in public. So the leaf was safe, and I carried the notary's sealed copy and his receipt. The second stone was the levy, the harbourmaster's letter naming Edric Sarn and Morwenna Aldous, married and taxed, alive, on the wedding year, a crown record from a crown officer. I had that letter, and I had written to Salt Fen a last time asking the harbourmaster to send a certified extract under his own official seal directly to the office of the Lord Justice of Eldermore, not to me, to the justice, so that the record would arrive in the one place in the kingdom that stood a little outside the Queen's shadow, and arrive by an independent hand, so that when I spoke of it, it would already be sitting on the justice's desk, uncorrupted, unhandled by me. The third stone was the man, Edric Sarn, breathing 3 streets away, the living contradiction of the story that he was dead. Him I could not fully control, and he was the stone the whole wall would stand or fall on, and he was the most frightened stone that ever a man built with. And the fourth stone was the one I had left. The withdrawal ledger was gone to conservation, but I had copied Bram Otley's entry in full, weeks ago, in my own certified hand before a witness. I had had the sour notary attest that copy too, the same day, swearing I had copied it faithfully from the original ledger then in the muniment room. So even the ledger they had spirited away I still held, in a form the law would hear. 4 stones, the false leaf certified, the living levy lodged with the justice, the living man terrified but calm. The dead clerk's entry attested, each one alone could be argued away. Together, laid in order before 1,000 witnesses who could not later pretend they had not heard, they were a wall, and no advocate living could pull them down fast enough to stop the truth from being loose in the world. But a wall needs a builder standing when it is built, and this was the last and hardest thing, the thing I made my peace with that sleepless night. I would very likely not be standing when it was done. The instant I broke silence at that altar, I would be a soldier committing the gravest breach of his post imaginable, interrupting a sacred royal rite in the king's presence to accuse the queen. They would seize me. They would have every right to seize me. My own brothers of the guard, good men who knew nothing, would lay hands on me under orders, and rightly, because from the outside I would look exactly like a madman or a traitor, and there would be no time to explain before they had me down. My whole hope was this, that in the seconds before they silenced me, I could say enough name the leaf, name the man, name the justice's desk where the record already lay, that the thing could not afterward be unsaid. That I could get the truth into the air of that cathedral, in front of the cameras of the kingdom, before their hands closed on my mouth. After that, it would not matter what became of me. A wall, once loose in the world, does not need its builder. I dressed at dawn in the red wool tunic, the third copy still sewn in its lining though I no longer needed it, a keepsake now, a soldier's superstition. I polished the brass. I whitened the gloves. I made myself, from boot to bearskin, the most immaculate yeoman of the guard the kingdom of Eldermore had ever put on parade, because if I was to break the discipline of 19 years I would do it looking like discipline itself, so that no man could say afterward that a slovenly cracked old soldier had ranted at the altar. Let them say instead, the straightest man in the guard stood up, in his best, and spoke. I was posted for the service, inside the cathedral. That was the final gift of their believing me bought. They had thought so little of the pensioned old statue that they had left him on the ceremonial roster, one of the ranked yeomen lining the great nave, a decoration, a red and black column among columns, close enough to the crossing where the king and queen would sit that a man could, if he were mad enough, step forward from the line and be heard. The cathedral filled. I have stood many great occasions and never one like it. The whole court of Eldermore in its finest. The choir in the loft, ready to sing the true coronation words over the false crown. The cameras of the kingdom on their stands, red lights burning, carrying the picture to every screen in the land. King Alaric came in on the chamberlain's arm, old and stooped and kind and utterly unknowing, and it near broke me to see his face, because whatever else this was, it was the ruin of the comfort of a lonely old man, and I would be the one to ruin it in his own sight, and there was no way to spare him and still save the truth. And then Morwenna. She came up the nave like the tide comes in, slow, certain, unhurried, in a gown the color of old wine, the second crown of Eldermore already on her head, the false queen at the summit of 10 years' patient climbing, and every head bowed as she passed, and mine among them because I would not tip my hand one instant early. She passed within 3 feet of me. I smelled the cold, clean scent of her. She did not look at me. To her I was furniture, a bought and pensioned nothing, and that was the last mistake she would make in her reign, and she made it beautifully. And behind the king's party among the household came Lady Verena and Lord Cassius, the daughter with her hunter's eyes sweeping the ranks, and for one cold instant her gaze crossed mine, and I gave her the far wall, the pensioned stare, the bought old man, and her eyes moved on. And Cassius, soft and sure, the son who thought himself a half-step from a throne he had no right to stand near, taking his place with the ease of a man who has never once been told no. Now came the terror, because my whole wall depended on the fourth and living stone, and the living stone was not yet in the cathedral. The plan had been that Halloran and his nephew would bring Edric Sarn in among the public. The great west doors were open to the ranked crowds who could not have seats, and the two of them were to have the old man there, warm and hidden in the press of bodies, ready to come forward when I signaled, and the moment was made. I could not see them. The west end was a sea of faces behind a cordon, and I looked and looked over the heads of the seated court, and I could not find the old surgeon's hard face, nor the nephew's, nor the shaking ghost between them. And the service was beginning. The great doors were being drawn to, and a horror colder than any yet went through me. That Edric Sarn had run. That the ghost had looked at the cathedral and the crown and the 10-year terror of the woman inside, and had bolted west after all, and that I was about to build my wall with the keystone missing, and be seized as a madman, and change nothing. The dean began the office. The choir took up the first psalm, and I stood in the line in my immaculate red with a hollow where my heart's whole hope had been, and I understood that I might have to do it anyway, leaf and levy and dead clerk. 3 stones, no man, and pray 3 stones were enough, knowing in my soldiers' bones that they were not, that without the breathing contradiction of a living husband it was a paper case and paper burns. Then over the heads of the court, at the very edge of the roped public, I saw a hand go up, not waving. Just up flat, held the old drill signal for here, present, ready. The signal Halloran had taught me 30 years before on a cold parade ground, and had clearly taught the ghost in the hours above his shop. Halloran's hard face beneath it, and beside him, small and gray and shaking but there on his feet, come at last out of 10 paid years of the dark. Edric Sarn, the lawful husband of the woman being crowned again before the kingdom, alive and present, and waiting for a soldier to keep his word. The service moved toward the renewal of the crowning oath. The dean turned to the king, and the king to the queen, and the great cathedral held its breath for the words that would set the seal on 10 years of a lie. I stepped out of the line. There is a sound a great crowd makes when a thing happens that is not supposed to happen, not a gasp that comes later, but a kind of silence that gets louder, a held breath multiplied 1,000-fold. That is the sound I stepped into. 1 yeoman of the guard out of the ranked line, 3 paces into the open floor of the crossing where no man walks during the rite, and every head turning, and the choir faltering on a note, and the dean's voice trailing, and the king's old face lifting in confusion, and the queen turning her head slowly, so slowly, the crown catching the light, to look at last at the piece of furniture that had chosen the worst possible moment to become a man. I did not shout, I want that known. I had rehearsed against shouting all night, because a shout is a madman and a level voice is a witness. I stood at attention in the open crossing of the cathedral, before the king of Eldermore and his court and the cameras of the whole kingdom, and I spoke in the clear carrying voice we are trained to use for the calling of the watch, the voice built to reach the far end of a parade ground without a tremor. Your Majesty, I am Corwin Vane, yeoman of the guard, 19 years keeper of the muniment room of Harrowgate. I beg the king's pardon for breaking the peace of this holy place. I would not do it for my life or my honor or any small thing. I do it because the crown that is on that woman's head was never lawfully hers, and I can prove it, and I will not stand silent 1 more hour, and let a lie be sealed before God and the kingdom. The silence broke then into the gasp, the real one, a wave of it rolling back through the nave to the great doors. I saw the chamberlain half rise. I saw 2 of my own brothers of the guard start forward from the line toward me, faces stricken, hands going out, good men doing their duty, coming to take the madman down. I had perhaps 10 seconds. I had planned for 10 seconds. I gave them everything. The marriage instrument of the king's second wedding is a forgery. I said it fast now, but clear, every word landing. The true leaf was taken from box 41 of the muniment in the 2nd year of the marriage, on a false pretext of verification, and a false leaf put in its place. A leaf written in a hand that is not the king's clerk's hand, and lacking the one clause the law requires, the declaration and dissolution of any prior bond. It lacks that clause because there was no dissolution. Because when Morwenna Aldous knelt to marry King Alaric, she was already a wife, the lawful wife of Edric Sarn, factor of the port of Salt Fen, who did not die before that wedding as the court was told, but lived, and was paid to vanish, and lives yet. I drew the breath for the last of it, because my brother's hands were astride from my shoulders now. The original forged leaf is lodged under seal with a notary of the town, certified and safe from any hand. The king's own harbour-master of Salt Fen has sent, under his seal, to the Lord Justice of Eldermore, the tax record naming Morwenna Aldous and Edric Sarn as man and wife, alive in the very year of this marriage. And Edric Sarn himself is in this cathedral at the west door alive, come to speak the truth before his king. That woman's crown is not legitimate. It never was. And I will answer to the law for every word, but let the law hear the words first. The hands closed on my shoulders. My brothers took me firmly, not cruelly as I had known they would, and I did not resist by so much as a muscle, because a struggling man is a guilty man, and I meant to be the stillest accused in the history of the kingdom. But I had done it. It was out. In the air of the cathedral, on the cameras of the land, 10,000 ears and 100 lenses. The wall was loose in the world. What happened next did not happen the way the false queen had spent 10 years arranging that such things happen. In private she would have had me gone and the words unheard. But this was not private. This was the loudest room in the kingdom, and she had walked me into it herself. Morwenna rose. Even then I will give her this, I who owe her nothing. She was magnificent in her ruin. She did not scream, did not deny in a rush, did not do any of the things a guilty woman does. She stood, tall and cold, and she said in a voice pitched to Carrie as well as mine, "The man is deranged. He has served too long in a cold cellar, and it has turned his mind. Take him out and let us continue." And it was well done, and in a private room it would have ended me, and half the court, wanting to believe it, murmured relief. But a private room has no old sister of the king in it who fears no one. Princess Adela had been seated at the king's left, Alaric's sister, the senior royal of the house, a spare, hard, upright woman of 70 who had buried 2 husbands and a dozen illusions, and had never in her life been afraid of Morwenna or anyone, and had, as the whole court quietly knew, distrusted the second marriage from the first day of it. She rose now, before the guards could march me off, and her voice cut across the cathedral like a blade drawn clean. "Stop!" Just that, and the whole procession of the moment stopped, because Princess Adela was not a woman one continued past. She turned not to me but to her brother the king. "Alaric, this man has made a specific accusation, with named records in the sight of the kingdom, and offered a living witness who is in this building. It costs us nothing to hear it and everything to silence it. If he is mad, we will know in 10 minutes and he will answer for it. But we will not drag a decorated yeoman of your guard out of your cathedral unheard while he names a forgery and a living man, on the word of the very woman he accuses. Send for the witness. Send to the justice. Hear it, now and here, where all can see it done fairly." There was a silence, and into it the king spoke for the first time. He was old and he was slow, and I had dreaded that he would be too far gone in comfort and grief to do anything, but let his wife's people carry me off. But King Alaric had not always been old, and something in Adela's voice, or in mine, or in the sight of one of his own straight soldiers standing accused and unresisting between 2 others, reached back to the man he had been. He lifted his hand. My brothers at that hand went still, and Alaric said in a voice that shook but did not break, "Bring the man from the west door. If there is a witness, we will hear him. God's house is exactly the place to hear the truth, if truth it is." And then to Morwenna, not looking at her, which was somehow the most terrible thing of all, "Sit down, madam, we will hear it." She sat, she had to. To refuse before the king and Adela and the cameras was itself a confession. She sat with her spine like a spear and her face a mask, and only I, close enough to see, saw the one thing that told me it was over, that her eyes went for a single flick to the west door, hunting for the ghost, hunting for the man she had believed dead for 10 years, and finding, when he was brought forward through the parting crowd, small and gray and shaking and utterly, undeniably alive, that there are some things even the most patient schemer cannot outwait, and one of them is a man who refuses, at the last, to stay buried. They brought Edric Sarn up the long nave, in a silence you could have carried in your hands. He was a wreck of a man, 10 years bought and buried in his western cottage, and he shook so that Halloran had to hold his arm, and I feared to the last that he would fold. But there is a courage that lives only in cowards who have finally had enough of being afraid, and Sarn found it in that isle. He stopped before the king. He would not look at Morwenna. He looked at the old king's kind, ruined face, and perhaps that was what steadied him, one old man to another, and he said, in a voice like wind through a broken door, "My name is Edric Sarn. I was a factor of Salt Fen. I married Morwenna Aldous when she was 17, and I was 30 before any king knew her name." He swallowed. "I did not die. A man came to me, I never knew his name, a lean, quiet man of the Chamberlain's livery, and he gave me a purse heavier than I'd see in 10 years of the sea, and a cottage in the West, and a new name, and he told me that my wife had risen very high and had no more need of a poor factor, and that if I loved my own life I would take the coin and be dead to the world and never say her name again." His shaking hands knotted together. "I took it. God forgive me, I took it, and I was dead 10 years, and I'd be dead yet if a soldier hadn't written me a letter that said the law hangs the man who forges and the man who bribes, but not the poor fool who's frightened into silence, and that a king was being cheated, and a dead queen dishonored, and a true prince robbed. I'm an old coward, Majesty. But I never freed her. There was no divorcing, no death, no dissolution. When she knelt to marry you, she was my wife. She is my wife under the law of Eldermore to this hour. I am sorry. I am so sorry. But it is the truth, and I could not carry it to my grave a second time. I have stood in many silences. That one had a weight I have never felt before or since. The Lord Justice of Eldermore was in the cathedral, as he must be at such a rite, and Princess Adela had him brought forward, and he confirmed before them all what he had received 2 days prior under the harbour-master's seal, sent to him direct and untouched. The tax record of Salt Fen, Morwenna Aldous and Edric Sarn, man and wife, assessed and alive in the year of the king's marriage. And a clerk was sent, under the justice's own warrant within the hour, to the town notary's strong-room, and returned with the sealed original of the forged leaf and the notary's certification. And there, held up before the court, was the thing itself, a marriage instrument with the king's clerk's name on it and not the king's clerk's hand, and no impediment clause where the law demands one stand, because there was no lawful ending of Morwenna's first marriage to record, because there had been no ending at all. 4 stones, the false leaf certified, the living levy on the justice's desk, the dead clerk's entry attested in my hand, and the living man unburied at last, standing gray and shaking and true before his king. Laid in order, in the loudest room in the kingdom, and no advocate living pulled one loose. Morwenna said nothing more. There was nothing to say that would not deepen it. I watched the 10-year edifice come down behind her eyes, quietly, the way she had built it, one drop at a time. Lord Cassius had gone white as the altar cloth, for the whole architecture of his ambition rested on his mother being the queen, and in the space of a quarter hour he had become the son of a woman who had never been anything of the kind. Lady Verena, alone of them, kept her hunter's composure, but she did not look at me again, and I think she knew that the fox had not, after all, been the one who was treed. The law did the rest, and the law did it properly, which is the whole point of doing a thing in the light instead of the dark. The Lord Justice ruled not that day, for such a thing is not ruled in an afternoon, but in the weeks that followed in open court, with counsel heard on every side, what the 4 stones made plain, that the second marriage, contracted while a prior lawful bond stood undissolved, was void from its beginning. That a void marriage yields no queen, and so Morwenna had never been Queen Consort of Eldermore, not for 1 day of the 10, and the crown she had worn twice she had never once worn by right. That the coronation, however solemnly done, could not crown what the marriage had never made. And that the children of that union, Lord Cassius and Lady Verena, were the king's to acknowledge or not as he chose in his mercy, but stood nowhere in the lawful line, which ran, as it had always truly run, though a decade of patient forgery had tried to blur it, clean and unbroken to Crown Prince Rowan, the true-born son of King Alaric and the late Queen Isolde. The forgery was a crime, and the law named the criminals, Morwenna herself for the bribing and the deceit of the crown, the lean, quiet man Doon, taken within the week, who had carried the purse to Salt Fen and the false leaf to Box 41 and had, it came out, done worse than that to the young clerk Bram Otley, whose too convenient death was reopened and no longer looked like sleep. The law took them, not I. I had only carried the truth to the one place the law could not help but hear it. That is all a guard is for, in the end, not to be the judge, but to make sure the judge is not lied to. They did not hang me for breaking the peace of the cathedral. Princess Adela saw to that, and the king, and in the end the whole kingdom that had watched it happen and understood what it had watched. But I will tell you honestly that I stood ready to be hanged, and would have counted it a fair price, because a man who breaks the most solemn right of his kingdom, even in the service of the truth, has broken something real, and I would not have it thought that I imagined myself above the discipline I served. The king himself settled it. He sent for me, weeks after, when the worst of it had passed over him and it had aged him. I will not pretend it did not. The truth is not always a mercy to the man who most needed it. He was quiet a long time, and then he said, "You could have come to me in private, Vane." And I said, "No, Majesty, I could not. In private her arm was longer than my life, and you would never have heard me. I had one chance to put the truth where it could not be unsaid, and it was the one place I most did not want to stand. Forgive me for the manner of it. I could find no other that she had not already closed." He looked at me a long while, an old man who had lost a comfort and gained a truth and was not sure, yet, that he had gained by the trade. And then he said the thing I have kept. "You guarded my house better standing in that aisle than you ever did standing at my gate. A man who guards only the walls guards nothing. You guarded the line." And he put me back where I belonged, which was the muniment room, the cold gallery under the east wing, keeper of the memory of the House of Harrowgate. And he made it by his own writ, a post that answered to the justice and the crown together, and to no chamberlain's office ever again, so that no lean, quiet man with a purse could ever again walk down that iron stair and argue with the past. Prince Rowan came to see me, once in the vault. He is a graver young man now than he was, having learned in the space of a season how close a patient hand had come to slipping his birthright out from under him one drop at a time. He did not thank me in many words. He is not a man of many words, which I like in him, and which bodes well for the day the crown is truly his. He only stood in the lamplight among the boxes a while and looked at Box 41 on its shelf and said, "It was all in here, the whole truth, for 10 years. And no one read it closely but you." "That's the work, sir," I said. "Anyone can guard a gate. The hard thing is to guard what's true when the true thing is quiet and buried and no one's looking, and the whole weight of the palace would rather it stayed buried. A crown is only ever as good as the record it stands on. Someone has to read the record. Someone has to carry the weight of the box 1,000 times until his hands know when it's wrong." Edric Sarn was not punished. The law kept the word my letter had given him. The frightened man bribed into silence is a victim, not the villain, and he was let go home to his western cottage, and he lives there yet, an old man who was dead for 10 years and chose, at the very last, to be alive. Halloran keeps his tobacconist's shop and takes no credit, which is the surest sign a man deserves it. And Morwenna, she who had climbed so quietly and would have reigned over a lie until she died in her bed a queen, went out of Harrowgate not in the night, as she had sent so many, but in the daylight, before the eyes she had ruled, no longer her majesty, no longer anything the palace was obliged to bow to, only Morwenna Aldous, the lawful and long-abandoned wife of a Salt Fen factor, undone at last by the one thing her patience never accounted for. A soldier who would not stop reading, and a poor man who would not stay dead. I stand my post still. The forecourt has its statue, and the crowds have their soldier who will not blink, and that is a fine and needful thing, and I honor the men who do it. But my post is the vault, and my watch is the truth, and I have come to believe there is no watch more sacred in any kingdom. A crown is only metal. What makes it a crown is the record beneath it, the true marriage, the true birth, the true line, written plain and kept honest by someone willing to read closely, and when the reading demands it, to step out of the safe line and say the buried thing aloud, whatever it costs. I stepped out of the line once. I would do it again tomorrow. That is the whole of what I have to tell, and it is the truest thing I know, that discipline is not silence. Discipline is knowing exactly which silence you must never keep.